Hello, everybody, and welcome again to another opportunity, another time that we call Tim Talks. And this is a time in which we can have, and you can lay privy to, and you can eavesdrop in on conversation between Timothy in ministry, as myself, just starting in fresh 6 years, and then a Paul in ministry that God has allowed to be seasoned with success and great ministry. We plan on having a conversation today that involves transformation, innovation, and motivation. And I'm excited today, and I'm excited about this guest that we have on. I cannot even believe this is the fifth session that we've had. It really just seems like we just started about a couple of weeks ago, but this is the fifth session that we've had, and man, it's been an absolute great journey. So I want to make sure that everybody gets on, everybody shares this video on your Facebook, on YouTube. Make sure that everybody logs on because this is going to be an absolute treat. I'm excited about who we have on today because, as I mentioned last week, that God has allowed me through Alphonso Jackson Sr., my father, and through my grandfather, Arthur Jackson Jr., and even my uncle, Arthur Jackson III, I've been able to lay privy to access to some of the greatest preachers and pastors in the country. And this man of God today was gifted to me by my father because he started a relationship with my father, a friendship, some years ago. And I remember as a kid going up to Conyers, Georgia, and even in the church that's a fraction of the size building, that's a fraction of the size that it is now, that I remember as a kid going into that church and it being packed out. And it seemed as if every year that my dad went up to preach for him, for this great pastor, it seemed like they were in a new church every year, a new building every time. And just, I mean, the Lord has tremendously opened up doors for this awesome giant of a man. And every time I've heard him preaching, and every time I've heard him speaking, every time I've heard his thoughts, even at a dinner table, it's absolutely just arrested my attention. And I said, Lord, who could I ask to come on? And the Lord dropped this prophet into my spirit, and I'm excited to have him. And listen, Tim Talk family, I want us to welcome Reverend Dr. Eric Lee from the Springfield Missionary Baptist Church in Conyers, Georgia. Pastor Lee, hello, sir.
Pastor Jackson, it's an honor to be here. I didn't make the Mount Rushmore of 10 talks, but I'm glad to be in the top 5. I'm glad to be here, and it's a blessing to be a part of your platform today.
No, man, listen, man, you are absolutely, man, you are absolutely on the Mountain Rushmore, man. And matter of fact, man, we had to take up some more money so that we can afford to go out of state, man. You know, you're the first out of state pastor that we've
Georgia
had
in the
on.
house.
And so everybody else has been local. But
Georgia
man, we had to go out of state, man, to get you, man. So I appreciate the just the time that you dedicating for us to come on and to have this dialogue and discussion. Pastor, man, how you doing, man? How you handling, man, the pandemic and dodging this virus, man, and how's the church been going and kind of adjusting with all of this in the times?
Well, today is June the 9th, and happy birthday to my mother-in-law, Diane
Happy
John,
birthday.
who is from Miami, Florida, as a matter of fact.
Oh, she's a great woman, man.
And yes, my wife is born in Miami, and then they moved up when she was 5 to Georgia. Happy birthday to her. Today's June the 9th. Our last worship service, we've got a 3,000 seat sanctuary behind us. And Our last worship service was March the 8th, when we were open to the public and to our congregation. So, we're 90 plus days into this pandemic, and the buildings that God gave us, the buildings that God allowed us to build, they're sitting empty, and we're all trying to figure out ministry together.
Wow.
And I have so much to learn from you, as much as you have to learn from me. So I'm delighted to be a part of the conversation. And God has certainly been faithful. The book of Colossians says, in Christ, all things hold together.
Yeah.
And I pray for all the pastors and ministries that are that are availing themselves to today's Tim Talk.
Yeah. That's tremendous. Pastor, you mentioned that behind you is a 3,000 seater, which is mind boggling for me, man. And knowing you, many people may just know Eric Lee now, Reverend Dr. Eric Lee now, but yet don't know the journey that you've gone through, and so they'll think that you started off at that 3,000 seater. But can you just kind of give us a brief, just narrative, man, of your story and how you got to this place that you're in now?
I think that that's important because people do equate where you are now with, and they don't see your history, they don't see your struggle.
Yeah.
We're 21 years into ministry here now, and your father has been with us. This is our third facility, and God just increased us every time. We went from a 500 seat facility to a 1,200 seat facility to a 3,000 seat facility, and God put us in a position where we were able to purchase each time. We didn't have to build, we didn't have to break ground because there were facilities that had become available. And one of the things that I shared with a number of pastors, because I know that there are pastors that are struggling, who were in building projects, who were looking at expansion possibilities. When we come out of this, regretfully, there'll be ministries that will not have made wise decisions and will have not survived fiscally the pandemic. And so I just want to encourage pastors, because one of the things that the Lord is showing us is that facilities is not everything. The campus is not everything.
Yeah.
Because every pastor I've talked to during COVID is preaching to more people now than ever before.
Right.
Reaching more people now than ever before. And some of them are raising more money now than ever before. And so we've got to see all of these problems as opportunities. And only God knows what the church is going to look like when we come out of this.
Yeah.
I talked about our facility. Even before COVID, people are not building 3,000, 5,000 seat sanctuaries any longer.
Right.
In Atlanta, Georgia. We consider ourselves the Bible Belt. Even people who can afford to build it aren't building it because technology has compelled people, has given people the opportunity, the convenience to take on the content of church at their own leisure.
Right.
Most of the people who watch us now don't necessarily watch us when we're live. They're gonna catch us at their own time,
at their own convenience. Right.
We're almost like we're putting up content like Netflix and Hulu now, hoping that people, if you got a 3 or 4 part sermon series, they might binge watch that.
Right. Yeah.
And may not wait 4 weeks to get it. So it's an opportunity. God has blessed us during an age of church growth that we're not necessarily seeing now. So the age in which Pastor Jackson Sr. and Springfield, that age in which the churches were exploding in attendance,
Right.
isn't necessarily the case anymore. It doesn't mean that that the churches aren't growing. It's just that people are not necessarily going to sit in physical buildings any longer. And we've got to be prepared to transition our ability to reach people who may only want to sit in our buildings once a month.
Wow. I want to kind of touch on that, Pastor, because that is absolutely true. That that church before the pandemic was already changing and trends were already moving, and so multi-sites became more popular, where you have a collection of smaller churches in size that made up about the same membership, or if not more, than a larger one church. And
Yes.
then the innovation of the e-campus, the internet campus,
Yes.
and those things. And so now, in which the system in which we're in now, or the society in which we're in now, where trends are now absolutely changed, where buildings are completely shut down. How does a pastor, and especially for a young millennial pastor, and a young tenured pastor who is not necessarily, not all millennial pastors are necessarily technology driven, or it doesn't necessarily mean they know how to do all this, and because many of us have been trained the physical church way. And so how do we kind of break out of the mold of the past and begin to become innovative to reach the people that we're talking to? Do we try to change the people back to, where we were, bring them back to the church building, or do we move with them? I guess that's a better question. How do we kind of navigate that?
I used to make the analogy that in order for to be candidates for pastor, in order for you to get the church where you're pastoring now, you had to learn how to preach to people that were already saved.
Yeah.
In order to, we're auditioning in order to get the jobs we have and the titles that we have. We're learning how to preach. It's almost like we're going to seminary to learn how to preach to people who already know the narrative, who already know the gospel.
Right.
And there's this whole world out here that has not been that are immigrants to church language and church culture,
right.
who really want to bypass church culture. They want Christ, but they're willing to bypass church culture, and so it becomes incumbent upon the pastor to realize, okay, well, this is what I had to do to get the church,
right?
But this is what I've got to do, something different to grow the church. And there's a difference between, revival preaching and pastoral preaching. There's a difference between going after the church and then advancing the church. And we've got to appreciate that it's a different skill set. It's a different competency that we're going to need. And there's some things that we're going to have to study that we've never studied before. We got to look at demographics.
Right.
We've got to look at the reality that the opportunity that the internet provides us. It was a great book. I think it was called Sim Church, a book about putting your church online. Why would you build a community with billions of people there and not put a church there? You would never do that architecturally. You would never build a city and not put a church there.
Right.
And so we've got to figure out what that means in our context. It's important for us to just kind of think outside the box about and envision what it's like. You know, maybe 20 years from now, we've got Google glasses on, watching church wherever we are, on a beach watching church.
Right.
So just being willing, because the times are going to force us to change.
Right. Yeah.
And I've always challenged our church to envision who is going to be singing Amazing Grace 50 years from now. And what do we need to do to make sure that there's somebody in this building 50 years from now singing Amazing Grace?
Mm-hmm.
And we've got to look at our culture. We've got to look at what it means to hand off from one generation to the next. How do you hand off a church to a generation that is suspicious of institutions, that's suspicious of the institution of the church? You and I are pastors' kids. You and I are third generation pastors. We have this passion and appreciation. And I know we're going to talk about social justice here in a minute.
Right.
But there's no better way to fight those battles than to have a strong Christian church that is a part of the arsenal that our community utilizes. So in our love for the church, what do we do to advance it, and what do we do to preserve it? And making sure that there are components of it in all of our innovation that never die. There are components of the church that you cannot, I mean, there's going to be things that change, but there are things that cannot go away lest you can no longer call yourself a church. If there's no Christian education, there's no church. If there's no fellowship, there's no church. If there's no worship, there's no church. If there is no evangelism and stewardship, if there is no service and discipleship, those things were present at the church in Acts chapter 2. Without them, you can hardly call yourself a church.
Right.
And so how do we preserve those pillars of the church and still present it in a fresh way to a new generation, whether that be millennials or Generation Z?
Yeah. That's
I
amazing.
don't have it all figured out. None of us do. None of us have it all figured out. And when you find somebody who tells you that they have it all figured out, you're going to have to discern that on your own, because all of us are still fishing to try and figure that out, because the church is intended to be intergenerational. And if your church is all old people, there's a problem. If your church is all young people, there's a problem with that too.
Right. And that you said something that was so key, man, that none of us have figured this thing out. And that's the beauty of it. Because, with the admittance of not knowing, the tested and proven formula, then it comes the opportunity to innovate and to be as creative as we want to be, as we have to be, as we can be, in order to reach goals that we would have never imagined before. And man, that is tremendous, and something, man, that really hit me, man. And I believe it leads us into the segue of our main discussion, and that is you talked about how do we engraft a generation? How do we hand off the church to a generation who is suspicious about institutions? And man, that in itself, that should be a book that you should write. Because it's absolutely true. This generation in which we are now, and of course we talk about millennials, but as you mentioned, there are at least 2 or 3 generations that are behind us millennials that people are not really giving conversation to, because everybody's focused on millennials, but millennials, we getting older, we're getting into middle age now. And and the generation behind us, Generation Z, is going to be tougher than us. And
Yes.
generation behind them, my kids, they going to be, they're going to be something. And so now we're in the climate in which we're in now, the cultural climate in which we're facing now is an attack from society onto the institutions in which have touted supremacy, and there's just this air of untouchability. And so the institutions of law and order, the institution of government, is now being called into question, and now being reassessed in a fashion in which we have not seen in decades. This level of this intensity of just reevaluation and protest and movements, and we've seen glimpses of this in the past few years, especially since the Trayvon Martin case and others to follow. But now it seems as if this is a little different. And my wife, Dr. Jamila Jackson, has talked about how all of this seems to be like the perfect storm of the COVID-19 and the killing of George Floyd and all these other elements that have come together and kind of just made this superstorm. And so my question to you is, with everything that's happening and the challenge of institutions, there's a generation of church people that are saying, well, the church needs to be on the forefront of this. But then there's a generation that's speaking back and saying, you all are institutions too. And how can institutions fight against institutions? And so, my question would be, in the midst of all of this cultural uncertainty and shifting, where should the church be? Is the church relevant in this? Is this the church's fight at all? Or should we just focus on, just Christ alone and him crucified, meaning just focus on, on Calvary and salvation, and then let everybody else kind of fight for themselves? What are your thoughts on that? Is that separate?
Well, I'll start by saying we're seeing systematic institutional deconstruction, and it didn't just start. I'll remember Ronald Reagan in his earlier speeches would say things like, "Government is not the solution to the problems. Government is the problem." And what we've seen, particularly from that particular party, is an assault on social programs, is a diminishing of the role of government in the lives of people, particularly the lives of people who have been victimized by systemic racial and economic oppression. And so there's been a reduction of the public's will to help people in need. We've seen also that institutional decline, or that decline in institutional trust in the church, and no one criticized it more heavily than Dr. Eddie Glaude, the professor of African American Studies at Princeton, who about a decade ago, challenged the church to be more committed to social justice, more committed to economic justice for African American people. Because the fact of the matter is, the African American church is still now, with all of the remnant support that we get, is still the number one financial institution in our communities. We are still the richest institution in the African American community by far. And so with that with that load, with that gift comes great responsibility. Eddie Glaude says that there are too many preachers who are feigning for followers rather than really serving the socioeconomic interests of African American people. In other words, we've been on the sidelines of social justice issues in the church in its current iteration than we were in the 60s, than we were in other eras of the African American church. And if we're going to be relevant, you know, we've got to discuss economic justice. We've got, you know, I hear preachers say all the time, well, you know, we ought to just preach the Bible and we ought to just preach the gospel, as if to say we ought, you know, we ought to not weigh in on current stuff and current events.
Right.
But how do you divorce the gospel from the social, from the political,
Yeah.
and from the economic?
Yes, sir.
When you read the Bible in its totality, God has an answer for all of these things. But the thing that we call the gospel is more of entertainment value and escape value than it is about being implemented in such a way that it changes systems and it changes the economic sphere of our lives. One of the things that that has haunted me over the last few years is this forecast that says that African American people are going to have zero net worth by the year 2053 or something of that nature. If I remember it correctly, they are forecasting 3 decades in advance.
Wow.
The kind of economic struggle we're going to have. How do we not preach to that?
Wow.
How do we, if they give us a 3-decade head start on these in this forecast, then we as the church have got to preach to the deprivation that's leading us toward a pathway where we might have zero net worth. We're in a position to do something about that.
Yeah.
If we're willing to listen and if we're willing to apply the gospel. You know, there's so much in God's word that speaks to the condition that we're in right now, and even the social justice crisis that we're in right now, if we're willing to look forward.
Mm-hmm.
But if all we want to do is put on a shout and show every Sunday, if all we want to do is fleece our flock to see how much we can expand the budget, then we're going to miss that mark. If we're going to focus on, and maybe the reason why God has us in the pandemic.
Pastor Lee, I think we lost
buildings and somebody else. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
I hear you.
Okay. I think
you got me?
Your picture went out. And so
yeah, I can see you.
Okay.
I'm working on this old cell phone. I said one of the reasons why, can you hear me fine?
I hear you. Mm-hmm.
Okay. I'll work on the video. One of the reasons why maybe we're in a season where we can't sit people in the buildings is because so much of the institutional church has been about buildings and budgets and the other one is butts and pews. That, you know, we put so much effort on the gathering of the church, but it really is the scattering of the church. What is going to happen between gatherings where we've got to really have a call to action for our congregations?
Yeah, that's amazing. And I want to push you, man, to go a little further with that. because you laid out a tremendous task and assignment for the church that we have to speak to these things. We have a responsibility to speak to these things, and when looking at the Bible speaks to the issues in which the people were facing at that time. And so, I think we miss the power of the text, of the power of Scripture, by only dealing with the issues that they dealt with, and not translating into where we are now. But my question to you is, what would that look like? So to expand our focus from, as you said, buildings, budgets, and butts, and then, get into how can we build our communities, reverse systemic systems that oppress our people. How can we speak to this, and what ways do we do that? So is it through protests? Should the church be involved in protests? And if so, should it begin and end with it? What are the ways in which the church can think innovatively and combating some of these social issues and evils in which we see run rampant within our communities?
The African American church, there's no way for a church to minister outside of its context.
Mm.
Our context has a lot to do with how we interpret Scripture, with how we hear the voice and the principles and the love of Jesus Christ.
Mm-hmm.
Because we come from a place of oppression, it causes us to be sensitive to those places in Scripture where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty.
Right.
Where there is liberation, African American antennas ought to go up. We cannot. There are so many disparities in our context that we cannot ignore, and a great deal of what we face as a community has a lot to do with white supremacy, with this notion of illegitimacy that has been cast upon us historically. We're a people that was born in slavery,
right?
And there's a lot of us who feel that that makes us illegitimate. There's a lot of them who feel that, but there's a lot of us who feel that.
Wow.
I have to tell you, there's a lot more of African Americans going to Caucasian churches than there has ever been of Caucasians coming to our church.
You're right.
And we've got to deal with that. We can't do ministry outside the context. That's my first response to your question. The second response is, what is the church's role in social justice? As you and I speak, and I don't mean to date your Tim talk, as we speak, George Floyd is being eulogized in Houston, Texas, and we've all been witness to the horrific death that we saw. What is the church's role? The church's role is not to ignore. The church's role is to encourage, to shape, and to point people to Jesus Christ, even in the midst of this crisis. The difference between the 60s and now is the church was the organizing wing of African American life.
Right.
That if we were going to organize, we needed to talk to pastors. We needed to talk to the church. We needed the church for gatherings.
Mm-hmm.
But now here we are 60 years later, and Black Lives Matters does not need the church to organize. They don't need pastors to
Yeah.
organize. They don't need our permission to march. They
Yeah.
don't need our blessing. There is such decentralized leadership out here right now. And I'm not criticizing Black Lives Matter at all, because they see themselves as doing something. They're shaking the trees in this community in ways, honestly, that the church has not.
Yeah.
They are shaking the trees. They are getting, there's a reason why Jordan is giving $100 million to social justice. There's a reason why Bank of America and all of these institutions are pledging as a result of what's happening in America's streets. And so the church would do well in our solidarity with protests. The church would do well to not look like we're trying to take it over.
Hmm.
I think the church would do well to help these organizations, often which many of whom are they're kind of making it up on the fly. There's a
Right.
lot of arguments in the streets
Right.
about strategy. And I think the church could do a great job of being a clearinghouse, being an arbiter between all of these factions who want to lead us. Because the truth is, the church was here before Black Lives Matter. The church was here before the protest. And the truth is, the church is going to be here after the
Right.
protests. And so we have to see ourselves as solutions to a problem, but not so much in competition with those warriors. And I give God praise for them, because they're holding all of our feet to the fire, and we need the agitation that they provide,
Yeah.
and they need, whether they can appreciate it or not at this stage, the stability and the ability to sustain the progress that we can possibly make in this season. So we need each other, but we can't afford to see ourselves as us against them.
Hmm.
I had a thought, everybody is calling George Floyd brother, but how many of them saw him as a brother while he was still walking?
Yeah.
And it's important for us to not wait until we're attacked and to not wait until we're destroyed before we realize that we're all in this as family together.
Wow.
Don't wait until I'm dead before you appreciate the gifts that I had to give. Don't wait until I'm dead for you to appreciate, the contribution that I can make.
Right.
I had a mentor who says, too many of us like our prophets dead. We don't like them while they're still alive.
Wow. Wow.
I hope that helps. I
Yeah.
hope that helps somebody.
Oh
I
man,
hope I answered your question.
that helped me tremendously. And what you said, man, is such a jarring truth. I was watching a live session with some great Black prophetic voices, and they were talking about the rise of Black Lives Matter and the Black church, and basically one of the guys that was on, one of the men that were on, I forget his name, but he mentioned that he was past himself. He mentioned that Black Lives Matter movement rose up because the Black church's mouth was muted with the tape of church growth. and basically saying that the church, the black church, had been so focused on growing the church building and growing the church congregation that they left their first love of the community. And so now, and you're absolutely right, there's this tension that we feel in the church, in the black church, because there are some that are saying this movement is not a movement because it did not come through the church. The church has nothing to do with it, and so the church should have nothing to do with its execution of it. But then there's others that have not taken that role and have joined in to it. So from my understanding, from what you're saying is that the church, your stance is that the church ought not seek to say, okay, thank you all for starting, and now we will take it over from here. And the church also shouldn't just say, well, y'all go ahead and we just gonna wait till y'all done, and then we'll come up with ours. But you're saying the church should join hand in hand and say to the Black Lives Matter movement, we're with you, and we're standing and marching with you. Am I correct in that?
Absolutely. I think there should be some mutual appreciation for what we can bring to the movement. It's some of us are going to have seats at the table. Some of us are going to be marching the streets.
Mm-hmm.
Some of us are going to be in a supportive role. But all of us ought to be able to have a voice in what the agenda truly is. We're all impacted by what has compelled us to march.
Yeah.
And certainly, I think that there is some legitimacy to the criticism that the church has failed to utilize all of our influence, to maximize our influence on culture and on communities. We have, one of the reasons why Dr. King was anointed to leadership in Montgomery, Alabama, when he was the pastor of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, is because there were preachers who had been in that community much longer than he had, with much bigger churches than him, who couldn't get along with each other. And so he became the safe choice because he was the new guy.
Right.
He was less threatening. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
So we have a way of silencing each other and canceling each other out. When one of the things I love about your father is that he is truly a moderator of preachers.
Yeah.
And he has the gift to bring pastors together who would have never gone in that room had it not been for him. And so, there's some legitimacy. Where the church has failed us, because we should have been more mature than we were in previous generations. And I hope we've gotten to that place now. I know that in our community, there have been churches collaborating that never collaborated before.
Mm-hmm.
We're helping each other deliver food to people. We're helping each other raise money for various things. And I hope that when it comes to Black Lives Matter, when it comes to this moment that we're in, that we see ourselves as allies and not as adversaries who are in the streets yelling for mic time,
Right. Absolutely. Pastor, I wanted to, as we close up on this, because I want to tell you, man, this has been a powerful session. And man, thank you so much, man, for your wisdom, your knowledge, man, your transparency. and just for your conviction, man, about this topic. But and in addition to the institutions that we talked about that this generation is combating, such as, again, law and order, the judicial system, and government. One of the institutions in which this country stands on is also being challenged, and that is the institutions of elections and voting, and an institution that our people fought hard to be participants of are now being essentially boycotted in a sense, because there's a generation of people that feel as if their voice are being muted, as they shout it out at the polls. It's being thrown out in the in the political rooms, and their argument has merit. We've seen, not just recently, but we've seen throughout the years, the abuse of responsibility with elections, and how those powers that be function with them. And then now we're hearing rhetoric from the top offices in government, saying that if it's election by mail-in vote, then it's illegitimate already. That it's not the real thing if you're voting by mail. So how do we combat this? And how can we, really have change? If voting is not being trusted, how do we kind of manage that? What are some things that we can put as safeguards? Is there anything that we can do to tackle this insecurity and uncertainty when it comes down to voting, and just really changing the system beyond just protests?
Yep. And I'm glad you mentioned, in addition to protests, because, it's certainly not either or, it's both and.
Right.
We protest and we also vote, because it took a protest for us to even have the right to vote. We are voting today, as a matter of fact. June 9th in Georgia is our primary day. It was pushed back as a result of COVID-19. I've got 3 of my children who are working the polls for various candidates right now. As a matter of fact, here on the campus of Springfield Baptist Church, we are a voting precinct. And so as I'm on the call with you, I'm watching people drive up to vote here at Springfield. I have 2 images in my mind today. One of them I put on a post on my Facebook and Instagram and Twitter. And I'm considering putting the other one up there to do today as well. The first one is an image of the long lines from April of 1994 in South Africa, when Nelson Mandela was elected president during the very first election where all South Africans, regardless of race, were allowed to vote. And that election lasted 4 days. And people stood in line for hours upon hours to vote. And they voted in President Nelson Mandela 26 years ago. And you could see the kind of pride and the kind of the kind of perseverance and passion that they brought to that moment, because it was their first time, and they realized how precious it was to have your vote, because your vote is your voice.
Right.
The second image that I have yet to put up is I found on Google a picture of a young Adolf Hitler casting a ballot in 1932.
Wow.
Adolf Hitler in Germany was voting, and they took a picture of him voting in 1932. The rest is history. My point is this: we need to understand every time we make a decision to vote, the people who despise us are still voting. The people who oppose us, the people who hate us, the people who can't help but push us to the background and cause us to be second-class citizens, they are still voting. Every time you choose to vote, there's somebody who despises you that's going to always vote. You cannot allow the people who despise you to outvote you. You need to vote every time you get a chance, because the people who despise us most certainly are. It's important for us to appreciate that while Moses was talking about let my people go, that the Pharaoh kept finding reasons to push them back. And I don't know how Moses did it with a stammering tongue, but he moved millions of people in spite of what the Pharaoh said.
Wow.
And we have a Pharaoh in America, and he's got the biggest microphone.
Talk, sir.
He's got the biggest social media platform. As a matter of fact, he doesn't have the biggest social media platform, but he's got the bully pulpit.
Right.
But we cannot allow our integrity or our passion to be maligned or destroyed by what the Pharaoh is saying.
Wow.
Because the Pharaoh, pharaohs come and go, but he's gonna get us through Egypt, and he's gonna get us through the Red Sea. He's gonna get us through the wilderness, and we ought to know that all things will work together for good. That's where the preachers come in, because we can't let Pharaoh have the last word.
Oh man, you preaching, Doc, man. You Pastor, you are doing it, man. That's heavy. Pastor, as we conclude, man, I do want to take one question that we've gotten a friend of mine, a colleague of mine, that is a young pastor in South Florida, Pastor John Murphy, out of Fort Lauderdale, and he texted me, and I'm gonna read what he said. He says, "Please ask Dr. Lee, how can the Black church abolish the slavery of incarceration?" And that actually kind of resonates with me, because I was just watching the Netflix show and documentary 13th, talking about the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery, but with the exception of for punishment of criminal activity. And the documentary on Netflix just talks about the decades, the generations of abuse of the 13th Amendment, of pretty much enslaving Black men and women for cheap labor. And so he asked, how can we abolish the slavery of incarceration in America? Any thoughts towards that?
Well, it's important to understand the narrative of George Floyd. George Floyd was an ex-convict who went to Minneapolis to seek a new beginning. Ahmaud Arbery had a criminal record, and when he was run down with mob violence, one of the men who ran him down was one of the officials who investigated his case.
Wow.
And so there is a role, the role of mass incarceration needs to be understood in the current moment that we're in. I just heard last night that when it comes to what's wrong in America, we're not going to arrest our way into transformation. And so we're going to have to see, you can't arrest enough people to make America safe. We're going to have to transform people. We're going to have to see the demoniac who at the end of that text is clothed and in his right mind.
Wow.
And certainly one of the things that we do here at Springfield, and I'm not against people going behind the bars to preach to people, but our entire prison ministry I hope you're not losing me, is anchored toward transitioning people from prison to society. We have a transitional prison ministry, and that means when brothers and sisters come out, as a matter of fact, we have service. We baptize them. We, for those who want to, but when they come out, our hope is to connect them with jobs, with clothing, with housing, that's going to help them in the rate of recidivism in our society, because so many of them go right back. So I want to challenge Pastor Murphy to structure a prison ministry that does more than just preach behind bars. But when there is an action, because listen, they go in by the thousands, but they actually get released by the thousands.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we're seeing right now is because of COVID-19, our jail cell here in Rockdale County is at 20% capacity. And I think it's important for all of us. How many people are in the jail? And the community is not going to hell because of it either. There's no uptick in crime because they released so many people from jail. But we got to give brothers an opportunity and sisters an opportunity. And there's so much talk about jobs, but a job is not going to get it done if it's not meeting needs, if it's not bridging the wealth gap, if brothers can't pay their rent, if we can't feed our families, then the job count is a false number.
Yeah.
And so economically, but also in terms of ministry, what resources can we put in place? Bishop T.D. Jakes did an awesome thing when he got a corporation to hire ex-offenders. Now, say what you want about Bishop Jakes. I mean, there are people who would love to see Bishop Jakes in the streets.
Yeah.
But his highest and best worth is talking in places where most of us don't have a voice.
You're right.
And he used his voice to convince a billionaire in our country to look at hiring ex-offenders, and maybe we can do that on a micro level. For those of us who don't have his influence, we can do it on a micro level and still make a difference.
Right, man. That's awesome. That's awesome, Pastor. Thank you so much for your time, man, and thank you, Pastor Murphy, man, for your text, man. I owe you lunch because I told him that he's incapable of asking a good question, because that's a good one. Inside joke between me and him. But thank you, man. I love it, man. Great question. But Pastor, thank you so much for your time, man, and man for your just amazing commentary, man, on where we are and where we need to go, man, and you've given us plenty, just a feast to just look over, man, and reassess ourselves, our strategies, and our future. And man, we're praying for you and the Springfield Baptist Church in Conyers, and hopefully, man, when all this blows over, we'll look forward to seeing you in person soon. As well, man. Thank you so much for your time.
Proud of you, Pastor Jackson. Happy anniversary, your 6th pastoral anniversary. And
Yeah,
I think your wedding anniversary falls in there somewhere too.
man, it's
God
amazing how
bless
you
you,
remember
man.
that, man. Wow. Yeah, 6 years.
God,
Yeah.
yeah, man. God bless you, and know that young family of yours is going to be in college soon. They're going to be, and so this is a moment, where we can really impact the generation that's coming behind Generation Z, as you already mentioned.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Pastor, I want to let you know, man, you were very inspiring for me until you talked about my kids going to college, man. Now you just absolutely depressed me. So now, man,
You better start saving that. I'm
man,
sending one to
oh man, I
Florida.
was
I'm
feeling
sending
so
one to
good before
Florida in the
then.
fall. I got one going to FSU in the fall. I'm sending one to Florida.
Oh man, FSU.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
all right, they're going to tally.
it's
Okay.
scaring the mess out of me. Yeah, yeah.
Man, I'm sure, man. Blessings upon you, sir. Thank you again. And man, listen, are you willing to come back again, man, one day and talk to
Absolutely,
Sims again?
absolutely. It'd be an honor. God bless, man.
Awesome. Thank you again.
Yeah.
Everybody, listen, thank you for tuning in. And we're going to be right here again next week, Tuesday, right here next week, again, next week, Tuesday, as we have another session of Tim Talks. I'm excited about it. Thank you again, and we'll holler at you soon.